Before we get started, I want to warn everybody that this podcast is dealing with the topic of domestic violence, awareness, and prevention. Some of the content that we will be discussing might be triggering or troubling to some listeners. If you or someone you know is experiencing some form of domestic violence, please call the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition hotline at 1-800-897-LINK. It's 1-800-897-5465. Hey everybody, welcome to Altabanking, the semi-regular podcast brought to you by Altabank. I am your host, Stan Sorensen. So according to a paper that was published in March of this year by the Utah Women and Leadership Project at the Utah State University, 1 in 3 women in Utah will face some form of domestic violence in her lifetime. And while this is close to the national average of a little over 37%, that's still much, much too high. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and Altabank has made domestic violence awareness and prevention one of our core public issues. As such, we are helping to create awareness around the types of domestic abuse, how to recognize them, and how to support victims. And we are working closely with a number of partners around the state on this effort. I am really pleased today to be joined by some of our partners. We have Jill Anderson from CAPSA up in Cache Valley, Jillian Penhale from the Dove Center down in St. George, Ashley Taylor, who's with the Refuge in Orem, and Lindsay Boyer, who is with South Valley Services in West Jordan. So I want to thank you all. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. I also want to take a minute to introduce Carol, who is a community advocate and is also a survivor. And Carol is here and is going to share some of her story with us as well. So Carol, welcome. Thank you for being here. If you would, I would like each one of you to take 30, 45 seconds or so and tell us a little bit more about your organization.
So South Valley Services is one of 15 victim service providers around the state that provides advocacy, safe shelter, counseling, community education, prevention education to the community, and also primarily focused on serving survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking.
Great. Jillian?
Yeah, the Dove Center serves those who are in Washington and Kane counties down in southern Utah. We have really the same services that Lindsay just named about South Valley Services. So definitely looking to serve those who are leaving situations of domestic violence or sexual assault. We have crisis-centered housing for them, counseling services, and really whatever the need is that person is presenting, we want to just provide wraparound services for whatever they need.
Great. Jill?
Yeah, I'm Jill Anderson. I'm the CEO of CAPSA. We're located in Cache County. We also serve Rich County, which is the Bear Lake area, as well as southern Idaho. We have similar services as the other organizations. We started in the late 1970s as the Cache Valley Rape Crisis Team, added domestic violence services, stalking, sex trafficking, all of those types of services over time.
The Refuge Utah, we serve victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Very similar services. Specifically, we're located in Utah County, serving Utah County, Juab County, and Wasatch counties. And again, just really focused on providing that advocacy, that support, and those services for those survivors in need.
My name is Carol Earnshaw, and I am a community advocate and survivor. And I've taken what I've learned and experienced and partnered with various organizations in the Salt Lake area and spoke and shared portions of my story. And my goal is just to help others to lose the shame, speak up, and ask for help. And so that's where I come in.
So I quoted a statistic at the outset, and that statistic was focused on abuse of a woman by a partner, spouse, what have you. And that's kind of, I think, what most people think of when they think of domestic violence. But there are a lot of different facets that run through this, and you mentioned some of them in your introductions. What are all of the different forms that domestic abuse and domestic violence might take?
I think that's a great question, Stan. I think there's a lot of maybe myths in the community that it only involves physical violence, and there's a lot of emotional and psychological abuse. We often talk about the power and control. Well, it really is based in someone's intent to gain power and control over an individual. And so all of us, I think, are focused on educating the community on how to identify domestic violence and then making sure that they're aware of our services. And we appreciate avenues like this to be able to get that word out to communities.
You know, people are familiar with the term domestic violence, but the word violence is so misleading that even survivors who are experiencing domestic abuse in a non-physical form aren't able to identify that they are experiencing that power and control dynamic because of the word violence, and then the violence is absent from the equation. And so to the point of awareness education, we can only work with so many people in our organizations. We can't cover the whole community. We need our communities to understand these issues. We need neighbors and family members and friends to understand how to identify it so they can help. So they can help connect someone who's in trouble with a resource that's specialized and that can help support them through the process, whether they are ready to do anything or they just are in a learning stage of what's happening and what can I do, or what are my rights, or what is okay, what is healthy, what's not. I mean, there's so many questions that need to be sorted through, right? So a lot of times people really gain so much ground from their support systems before they even get to the point of accessing services. And that's what we really need to do, is build up the knowledge and the awareness of our community so they can help one another and help them know where to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to add to that, domestic violence, or the term intimate partner violence, it can happen to anyone. And I think, like you mentioned, and for our organization, sure, statistically the highest number of victims we serve might be women, but we also serve men in our programs as well. We also have intimate partner violence for a couple that's the same gender. It can really happen in any relationship. And so I think also removing some of that stigmatism that, if you're a man and this is happening to you, that you can also seek help and you can seek services, or, and kind of to the points that have been made, a lot of our community just thinks of it in a very specific violent act when there's just so many variables that could take place.
Yeah.
Our agency specifically changed our name a few years ago. We originally were founded as the Center for Women and Children in Crisis, which fits into that category of, we assume it's happening to women and children, but we wanted to make sure that our name was inclusive of everyone we serve, because we know it affects everyone, and everyone needs to be able to have access to those resources.
I was going to say, there's so much fear in a victim that to even just reach out and tell someone or ask for help is a huge leap of faith, because they have no idea what the repercussions are going to be. As soon as they speak their truth, their whole world could completely disassemble. And so having those resources, having familiar language, I don't feel like I had that at that time. It just wasn't in the conversation. And I lived in a big city. So I would just say community education is so key to bringing awareness to everyone.
Yeah.
I think that's such a great and really critical and important point that we get out in the community, is that these services are confidential, and that they can call and they don't even have to give us their name. They can just talk about the situation. We can give them resources, and because that is a very scary call to make, and knowing that you have an advocate that will believe you, that will support you, and that we can do that confidentially, and you don't have to trigger a system that you might not have control over.
Sure, and even, these support systems are intact even for friends and loved ones of a victim, so they can call and ask, I have this situation. what's the best way for me to proceed? Because sometimes you're just walking on eggshells, even as supporting someone.
Yeah, and I wanted to be sure to touch on that because I think that there is a role that is perhaps not emphasized enough, which is the role of family and friends and what they, sort of how do we educate them to recognize signs of a potential problem and then what they can and should do to offer support.
One of the questions we sometimes will hold survivor focus groups and ask them, what can we do better in our service and service delivery? And we often get that question from family and friends, how can I support this person? What should I do? And so we ask survivors that. And what should we tell them? And sometimes it's not the answer that people want to hear, but the resounding answer was stick with us, because leaving is not an event, it's a process, it takes time, and they ask family members to be patient, stick with us, be supportive, and just be there with us through the process, because it is a process.
And it takes sometimes average of 7 times that a victim will leave and come back before they resolutely decide to be done.
And I think the key to this too is if a survivor leaves on terms that are not their own, it's just that higher chance they're going to be right back. They're going to go right back in the situation because there's so much fear and shame wrapped around it. So for family members to understand that there's so much that goes into this process, their patience is critical in order to make sure that the survivor's ready and that they can do it safely, because it is the most dangerous point in time for a survivor is when they're leaving or right after they've left. And if they don't do it on their terms with a safety plan and somewhere safe to land, it could be more dangerous for them. And I don't know that family members necessarily understand those dynamics, and the obvious answer is to get out. But it's not that easy. It takes a process and support.
Yeah, and I think too, you kind of like was mentioned, the control that the perpetrator has for that victim. Even though as an outsider in the situation, you might be frustrated and upset, like, why do you keep going back? Well, that relationship, even though it is dangerous and difficult, could be the most comfortable thing to that survivor for that time until they really feel ready to leave. And that's really hard for an outsider to understand. And, even for us that, are serving survivors every day, there's times when, you're talking to someone and then they leave and go back and you're thinking, I thought that they got it this time. But everyone has to have their own process and they have to make that choice themselves or they won't be successful in leaving.
Talking about power and control, they've had power and control taken away from them in that abusive situation. So helping to empower survivors to be able to make those choices, that's a process too. So I think for family members, it's easy maybe to say, you should just leave, you should just do this, but really helping to empower them to be able to make their own choices and decide what they want to do next in their lives.
Yeah.
And support their confidence.
Right,
in,
exactly.
In taking
Help
that
build
on.
them up in that.
It can do more harm than good, I think, when you try to tell someone what to do, because your whole goal is they've had a loss of power. So you're trying to do everything you can to support them, to empower them with, you can make your own choices. You have a choice in this, and I think that's really vital.
When you talk about control, what are some of the ways that an abusive, or that a perpetrator, I guess is the better way to put it, what are some of the ways that a perpetrator might try to control the survivor?
Let's start with money, not having access to the bank account. I mean, it could even be as simple as the vehicle that the victim is allowed to drive, or is their vehicle is never more, the tank is never more full than maybe a quarter of a tank. Then they literally can't get far. They literally can't leave. So there are a lot of tactics when you think just financially alone to control someone that can keep someone trapped and isolated, further isolated.
We see isolation from friends and family, right, to make them really rely on just that other person in their relationship so they don't have those other close ties. That often happens as well.
I think a big one too is controlling their ability to reach out to others. So they might control their cell phone, the house phone, or, one thing that even for friends and family member too, to offer, hey, do you need to use my cell phone to call to call this service, because they might feel like they can't, because if they do, they're going to see that in whatever software they have on the phone that can see calls and things.
Yeah, tracking them
Yeah.
through technology and that kind of thing. And like, in addition to removing them from any resource, family or friends, and the financial, but maybe sabotaging their job so that they don't have that, which leads into how do I afford rent and housing in this difficult housing market that we live in. There's a lot of factors to consider.
I think it all starts right here. It's in the mind. It starts with some form of mind control or manipulation, coercion, gaslighting, where they try to alter your reality. Your responses are not heard. They're turned and used against you. So I think that it starts there, and then once they can open the door, and it continues and can go into all forms of violence.
And that gets even worse when there are children involved, because now there's more leverage to diminish the victim's credibility. If they make one error, one misstep, or there's something to hold over their head, now there's the threat of custody of their children if they ever try to leave. And I've watched that just time and time again. It's such a powerful control tool in and of itself, but it all starts with convincing their partner that they aren't the credible parent. The court won't see them as competent, and because they're already starting to doubt their own reality, literally, that becomes more and more believable. So us on the outside, we might be able to see that's just simply not true. But that person hearing that over and over and over again, layer upon layer, comes to believe it wholeheartedly, and it's scary. It's really, it breeds more fear and more isolation, breeds more of that self-doubt. And so it's just this vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All those things tend to compound to make it so that they feel like they can't leave, right? So from the outside, we talked about friends and family may think that's the obvious choice, but internally there are so many different factors that make it feel like it's impossible to leave.
I just wanted to emphasize that while we just talked about how difficult and challenging and all of these barriers are, even just talking about it here can make you feel hopeless, but there is hope, and there is a network of experts across the state in all of these organizations that are experts in navigating this, and will take it step by step. You direct the direction we go and the steps we take, but we have the expertise in our organizations to help make that happen.
And that's why it's so important for our communities to understand, A, this is tough stuff, this is difficult, there are complex barriers, and B, that's why we need specialized service providers.
Yes.
So that they are able to help someone navigate, someone they love and worry about, that there is a path and that there is hope, but where, which way, what direction, which number, which website. And that's the key, is it really is critical to have specialized resources and support in order to navigate those complexities.
That actually brings up a quick question. I've spoken over the last few days with some folks in the healthcare, the physical healthcare areas, and they talk about shortage of providers, right? We all know there's a nursing shortage. There's a, good luck trying to find, get in to see a primary care provider, right? Sorry, you in Intermountain. Are you seeing that there is also a shortage in experts that you all need to hire into your organizations or work with your organizations in support of the community?
The need always outweighs our capacity.
Yeah.
We're getting there, though.
I mean, really, when you think about the statistics, 1 in 3, we often do a lot of education in business to educate the community. If you think about your life, you're either at home or at work 90% of the time. And if you're not safe in the core of your life at your home, work might be the only place you have access for resources. And so that's a strong connection. And so when you think about that, the number of people, 1 in 3, you start counting. And so we'll tell businesses, look at the number of employees you have. If you count 1 in 3, your workforce is significantly impacted by this. And if they're not personally, they know someone who is. and it's going to take all of us.
Going back to this, going back to the idea of control for a minute, and and how difficult it is to leave that situation. And Carol, you and I were talking when
Sure.
We first got started, and I can't remember exactly the phrase that you used, but it sort of struck me as there's a level of embarrassment or a level of shame as you begin to reach out and seek help.
So many times you might see when it's happening when a victim leaves, but most of the time, the average person could not tell if someone's being abused, especially if it's not physical, right? And the majority of abuse is going to be, psychological, spiritual, and emotional, especially when it's kept under wraps, right? Because it's so isolated usually, and that's the perfect breeding ground, right? If you have shame, isolation, those things are going to keep you quiet, and they're going to keep you, even though someone said, you'll stay at the status quo, like that's comfortable because it's predictable. The whole cycle of abuse is very predictable, right? We have an incident, then we have, then we have the apology, and then things are kind of good for a while, and it keeps going until pretty soon you don't even know what's happening because it's so, you're just like, this is just our relationship,
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first step is being able to find someone that you trust to share your experience with. And for me, it was 18 years before I ever told a soul.
And I'm going to assume that's not uncommon either, right?
And I think there's several different reasons. Like you said, sometimes it's that initial step is terrifying, right, to take. But as we were talking about how friends and family can support, we always talk about start by believing. Because sometimes you won't know. You won't see any physical signs. You won't see anything in the relationship that, from an outsider's perspective, is a red flag. But inside the relationship, you don't know what's going on. So starting by believing the survivor and making sure that they know that they're supported and that they have a safe place to be able to tell their story so that then hopefully they can get help.
One of the things during one of my visits up to our branches up in Cache Valley, Jill, one of the members of your team was there doing their quarterly discussion, right? So in our branches in Cache Valley, we have somebody from Jill's team come once a quarter and talk about, sort of giving statistics and things, obviously, and talking, sort of about the, sort of state of affairs, but as well, helping them to understand how, as an employer, you can recognize that there might be issues and how you can be supportive.
Similar to what you were saying about an outside perspective, family and friends, and what they don't see, an employer might see, they might perceive that they're just not a good employee. If they're late or they're showing up or they're constantly getting calls from their partner, text messages, they may not be an attentive employee, but they may also be in a relationship. And so we try and teach managers in businesses how they can identify that in their employees, how they can approach it, asking the question, are you okay? Are you safe at home? And then how do they respond if the answer is no, I'm not? That can be scary for an employer or a manager. And so we teach them how they can respond to that. And a large part of that really is, again, like calling in the experts. I know in our area, we are happy to respond to the business. We'll send an advocate. They can sit down and do safety planning and things like that. But it is all the way from wearing purple shirts during October Domestic Violence Awareness Month, signals to employees that we care about you, we care about the community, and that might give them enough safety to go to somebody within that company that they trust and speak up for the first time in 18 or more years.
And it might be someone that's already shared their story. I've had a lot of people come to me because of my vulnerability and being, honest. And so it comes in but the more authentic you are, the more people can share their authenticity and shame or secrets with you. And it's the hugest burden, even though the work is just starting, it's the hugest burden to share with someone.
think Jill mentioning the word safety, right? Creating that safe environment so that employees feel like they can reach out if they need help, and creating that safe space and asking the right questions that they can feel like they can open up, because that can be very scary if you feel like you might lose your job or that you aren't living up to the performance standards or something like that. But creating that safe space so they know that there can be help without any consequences to their employment.
Well, and traditionally, these are private family matters. They don't belong in the workplace, right? I'm sorry, that's a matter of, that's traditionally the mindset. So even if there is an educated employer, there's going to be that hesitation of whether or not I'm going to be at risk of, my employment being on the chopping block if I'm bringing my problems from home into work. But there are very real situations, whether that's I've just filed a protective order, or I am leaving or planning to leave, or I need to take some time off, and to know that you can safely ask for those things without being afraid of, well, this is going to be seen as, this is the workplace, we need to keep it workplace related.
Yeah.
Actually, no, we need to understand what's going on with our people so that they have the support they need to continue working with us. And if employers understand these issues are real and they're affecting a lot of business, like members of your teams and even your management, then they're more prepared for it, but also, again, prepared for how to respond so that they can say, you know what, let's sit down and how can I help? Rather than freezing, right, in the moment of, I'm not sure what to do with this. And that's where I think we've got to break some of those assumptions, those traditional mindsets, and understand that, there is a space to have this conversation. It's not taboo, and that more employers are getting the education. And we're moving in a really good direction that way.
Yeah, and I think if you do have an employee or coworker that you're concerned about, trusting your gut and being bold enough just to ask them if they're okay and start because they may not tell you what's happening in that first interaction, but by starting to create that place of safety and continuing to check in with them, they might open up eventually, and you're really helping save their life if they need to get out of that situation.
I'm struck by the idea that as an employee of a large publicly traded institution, every single year, and as a manager, every single year I have to participate in sexual harassment training, right? Which is the right thing to do, by the way. But I have never, ever had to go through a training that addresses the issues that we're talking about. And it seems to me that those are equally as prevalent, and that we should, as employers, be putting all of our employees through that exact same type of training.
It's one of the things that we tell businesses. I think we kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but we can't be everywhere.
Yeah.
But you can. If we get all businesses and family and friends engaged, I think it could make a big difference.
Even creating policies that allow for that to be a part of your written policy. There's often policies on we will not tolerate this or we will not tolerate this. The policies regarding domestic violence and the support that you'll receive if you are going through that, so that someone really knows that the company is concerned about that. They have that on their mind, and it is something that can be addressed in the workplace.
And providing that training and requiring it does send a very clear message to employees. So that in and of itself alone is, communicating support.
I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I want to talk about the legislation that was passed in the last session. It seems to me, and I've read as well others' perspectives, that this last session the legislature has done more to, offer protection, support to victims and survivors than ever before. So I was hoping we could have a conversation about some of these bills, what you think some of the outcomes are going to be longer term, and what's left to be done, because I know there's a lot. Sort of your wish list, right? What would if the governor was here right now, what would you tell him should be the next priority pieces of legislation to come up?
For us, one of the most, I would say, the one that's impacted us probably the most is what most people know as the LAP bill, which is the lethality assessment protocol. And so legislation passed that does require all of throughout the state of Utah, for every police department to be trained and follow the lethality assessment protocol. So when they're called out for a DV situation, or they come upon a situation and think that there might be domestic violence, they'll do the lethality assessment protocol, which is a series of questions that they ask. And there's certain markers that if the answer is yes to that, it's what's considered high lethality. And so for the bill, it gives that police officer the opportunity to connect that victim to services, and give them a connection point, which the best practice for that is for them to call with the victim to one of our agencies, so that they can talk to one of our advocates on the phone. All of us have, 24/7, phone lines that they're talking to and calling. And I think, for all of us, everyone's super excited that passed, and that, more victims will have access to services. I think, we often talk about, which has been mentioned, that it can take statistically 7 times to leave a violent situation. And I always think of that every interaction is one of those 7 times. So every call that's made, every connection point that's made is really impactful. So I think that that's super impactful. On the other side, for our agencies, our beds were already full, and so we've seen, even in just the rollout, there's been a massive increase of calls through just through that protocol. And so I think I can speak for Dove, but I know it's probably shared with everyone, the concern of just our capacity and being able to, serve survivors the best that we can.
Okay. And just to clarify, the LAP bill also includes the university police forces as well, correct? For the state universities. I don't know if the privates are part of that or not, but for the state universities.
Yeah, and all of the park services, every single police department. Yeah.
We had been doing it on a voluntary basis, I guess, since 2015. There were 4 agencies across the state that kind of piloted the program, and have been doing it for quite some time. And I think Lieutenant Governor Henderson recognized the value of that protocol, and that it was very much needed across the state. And we have good relationships with our local law enforcement, and we're getting quite a few calls. But now that it's mandated, they don't have to choose to do it; they have to do it. And since the start of that in July, we had 50% increase in the number of calls coming to us through our local law enforcement, which, as Jillian mentioned, creates a wave of survivors coming that we're now struggling to meet that demand and need.
I think that was something else in this past legislative session, that they did pass specific funding to help out victim services, which was huge and monumental. And I think part of that was in hopes to be able to respond to some of that. But unfortunately, our organizations, our grant funding can be very variable. We've all seen decreases in our grant funding. And so the money that the state has appropriated has been a huge help in that. But now we're seeing this huge increase in the number of people that are seeking services and trying to find the funding to be able to keep up with the capacity to serve those individuals.
I have a whole bunch I could talk about. Let's move on. They've covered the highlights. It's a lot.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's really, really good.
Yeah.
And it's also a little bit the cart before the horse when you think about, okay, we're going to implement this new factor that's really going to help elevate our impact with an existing protocol that we've already found to be effective and helpful, right? But then it's like, how do we set ourselves up for success so that we can be careful not to discourage anybody, whether it's law enforcement, legislators, survivors that are on the other end of that line. And, there's no room at the inn. There's no room at the inn. We can't just put a cot out on the back porch. Right. We have to come up with other alternatives. And that's the part where we really need more conversation, is how do we plan for this? What are our resources, and what are our alternatives to make sure that, whatever it is, I mean, shelter is just one piece, right? Not everybody wants or needs safe shelter. But we also have, only a limited amount of case managers and clinical counselors or support groups and whatnot, where we want to be able to provide all of that. We want to be able to provide more of all of that, not just beds. We need to be able to really grow our programs so that we can do it justice and serve the need. And that's why this is so exciting. It's like, this is so good. We're going in the right direction. When you think about the large institutions that we need to care about this issue, I mean, businesses is just, the one piece of it.
Right.
Legislators and elected officials, there's these, religious institutions. Like, we need to have these places of influence in decision-making or just leadership to really understand and get behind us, not just like, okay, well, what's going on, but what do survivors really need?
Yeah.
And I'll
where
add,
we need to go.
I'll add to that too. It does, we've talked about this, it takes a level of expertise and training and a very highly skilled workforce, because these are dangerous situations and these are people's lives. And you mentioned, do you have a hard time keeping staff and having enough staff to do that highly trained work? It takes resources to be able to do that.
I think, like you mentioned, it's so important that it's the survivors' voices, right? That we have expert staff, but listening to the survivors' voices and hearing really what do they need and what are those resources that are so important, so that we can make sure we're providing exactly what they're looking for.
And we might think the answer is shelter beds.
Right.
When maybe it's something even easier to provide. Well, okay, let's put our energy into making that happen, because we can get there faster than we can build more shelter space, right? And so there's a lot of creative ways that we can help meet needs and problem solve. But we've got to be able to have the capacity to get the conversations going and then be able to follow up and see it through.
I mean, there's so many things that would be benefited from community protocol, right? That it's more of a, we're all in this together, instead of we're all just trying to take care of our little areas. But one thing I was going to say is that, Utah is 1 out of 3. The national average, isn't it 1 out of 4? So, I mean, I'm so glad you're taking, Altabank is supporting this, but it is a serious issue here. And, I don't know all the stats, but we really, we need the whole community to be on board.
One of the things that, and it kind of, goes back to everything we were talking about with respect to embarrassment and shame and awareness and all of these different things, but there is a part of me that wonders if one of the attitudes that the community has in general is not my business, right? Oh yeah, people next door to me are having an argument, not my business.
It's that private family matter mentality.
Right, yeah.
And it's not, it's a community issue.
In the town I was in, the #1 call to police is domestic violence reports. So it is a community issue.
We've talked about that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness. So when you really think about all the factors and all the things that affect the full community, domestic violence really affects a lot of different facets that affect everyone as individuals as well.
To that end, I know that all of you have a shelter program. Are you also working with sort of outside of the domestic violence circles, if you will, with organizations that are trying to provide affordable housing on a broader scale?
And we have a housing program that's specifically targeted at getting individuals into safe, permanent housing. And so that can be some help with some rental assistance, or if someone's starting over, they usually don't have the amount saved up to do a first month's and a deposit, right? That's a huge cost to try and getting into new housing. And so we're able to provide some temporary rental assistance, but it is working with a lot of different landlords, maybe private landlords, different apartment complexes, as well as housing authorities, to make sure that they can get into housing, because there is such a shortage of affordable housing. And when we talked about financial abuse, sometimes it's their credit has just been destroyed, right? Because of the financial abuse, and it's not anything that they've done, but now they're trying to combat that to try and get into housing. and just barrier on barrier. So coming up with some new creative ways to help them break down those barriers and get into safe housing is a huge step. We talk about the housing first model, right? If they can get into housing, if they can have some safe, stable place to be, then they can start working on all of the other pieces to be able to put their lives back in the line that they want it to be in.
I think that's why a lot of us have developed our own housing programs, because of those barriers that clients face getting into, that have had their credit destroyed, and they can't get into other housing, and so we're here to support them through that and help rebuild credit, have economic empowerment programs tied to our housing units, and
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I know, at Dove and St. George, we're definitely working through our local homeless coalition with other agencies, but with the housing crisis and affordable housing in Utah, everyone is stretched on what they can provide. And I think kind of to the point that Ashley was making, for victims of, violent crime, and this stat is true for victims of sex trafficking, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, when you have experienced a certain level of trauma, statistically 2 years of wraparound services is actually what you need to fully be able to move on is not the correct word, but to be able to find stability, keep that permanent housing, because you have to have all the things that go along with that, like the counseling services and the case management and all the support that you need. And so kind of similarly to what the other programs I've mentioned, our goal has been trying to expand on what we would call transitional housing. So like you mentioned, shelter is a first step spot. So for all of our shelter, they are crisis oriented.
Right.
And the goal is to get someone into something that's more permanent or longer term as quickly as possible so that they can really start the steps of stabilizing.
And the transition to getting to that independence phase, it takes time. And so I love the Dove Center's transitional housing program. I love all the transitional housing programs, but I can speak specifically because I watched the impact.
Yeah.
I watched what that transitional stay created for survivors who needed a little more time. And it's not because, they got to find a job and then they got to find housing. They're trying to heal trauma. Their trauma can sometimes be a barrier to daily functioning. And if we're just sitting here saying, well, you gotta get to work, you gotta move on, you gotta keep putting one foot in front of the other. Yeah, that's easy to say, but what else is going on? What else is getting in the way? And there are a lot of barriers that really understanding the role of trauma, and what those moments of, I'm not sure why I couldn't get out of bed, or I'm not sure why I sabotaged that job interview that I was so excited about, because there was probably a trauma response of some sort that got in the way somewhere along the day.
Yeah.
And they themselves sometimes are just as perplexed or frustrated or discouraged. And as long as we're able to say, no, there's nothing wrong with you right now. You're experiencing a hard situation, and trauma, it deserves some time and attention. It deserves this longer period of, we're here to support you. We have a variety of different ways for you to access, whether it's support with support groups, with peers who are experiencing similar trauma barriers, or whether it's your case manager that understands what's been getting in the way that you can call up. There are so many different pieces to that journey, and the longer we can keep survivors engaged in that support system and that process, the better chance that those bricks of stability are building together to have a solid foundation. And if we don't have that opportunity to work with someone more than just maybe a really short-term crisis stay in a shelter, then it's a high probability that they will likely need to access services again. So the longer we're able to extend their engagement in supportive services, and that's really what transitional housing allows. And it's really impactful.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a story of a client who had gone through, or a survivor who had gone through our program, was towards the end of her program, and we were able to get her enrolled at Utah State University. And the first day when she walked into the class, and it was one of those big classrooms and everybody's bumping into each other, she had to leave because the trauma came back, all that closeness and the bumping and And our therapist helped walk her through some techniques she could use so that she could go sit in that big classroom and interact with all those people and progress and move forward. So
It's
it's
a great
to
example.
that need. Yeah.
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 And I think anyone who's experienced any form of abuse, they can understand, but a victim does not trust themselves. They might have little spots where they ask for help, right? But their brain has basically been rewired during this abusive period. And so it's a long process. And yeah, the resources they're limited, but they are so needed for the rest of their lives, because most of them will be in some way or form. I'm guessing that a lot of them are mothers. So they're still working and trying to deal. It's not like they just moved to another country and got a fresh start, right?
Yeah.
So,
That continuous exposure
yeah,
to reminders.
yeah.
Again, I'm struck by this idea that, you will have people talk about being in therapy for all kinds of different things for years and how it's a process. And it, based on some of what you're saying, it kind of feels like there is a little different expectation here potentially that, it's sort of the quick fix, right? Oh, you're out of the situation and everything's going to be fine now, right? Whereas it's identical to, really most forms of therapy, right? Most forms of recovery from addiction, anything like that, right? Where it's kind of a lifetime journey, if you will. So I am kind of wondering why people think that it's, that this is different. This type of situation is different.
I think part of it is the community perception that it is a physical violence. So if you leave the situation, you're away from the physical violence, problem solved, right? But not realizing the trauma and how that affects the brain and how it could have been going on for a long time, and there are other types of abuse that have been happening. And like you said, it is a recovery process from that, right? That it's not just removing from a dangerous situation and then you're home free, right? But it's really that there is a recovery from that and learning how to process things, process the trauma that you went through, understand what that did to your brain, and then understand all those different intricacies that really happen with domestic abuse and how to be able to move forward from that.
One of the things that I also want to be sure that we talk about, we talked earlier about the gender piece, right? And, there's sort of this perception that a lot of it is, women are the victims, men are the perpetrators. I think, and I'm wondering if there's sort of a bit of ageism in there as well, right? Domestic abuse is something that happens to adults. What about college students? What about high school students? The early teens, you're starting to get into dating, things like that. I mean, I'm kind of assuming that there, just like there's no sort of gender delineation here, or differentiation here, rather, there's no age differentiation either. Is that correct?
We have a survivor that is on our board, and she shares her story that she met her abuser in high school, and they were high school sweethearts. And looking back on it now, after she's been through a lot of different processes in her life, she sees that there were signs when she first met him in high school that showed that progressed and became an abusive situation. I know everyone has different prevention programs, but getting into high schools and learning at a young age about healthy relationships and what that looks like, or safe dating techniques, especially if they haven't had healthy relationships exhibited in their home. That's all they've seen, right? And they don't know what are the signs of a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship. So being able to identify that early on so that you can seek out healthy relationships and try to avoid some of those red flags that you can see.
And teenagers are especially vulnerable because developmentally, that's the time of life they're trying to find their sense of belonging. And acceptance is really important. I mean, I think about what I know now. If I would have understood then, oh my gosh, the difference in, things that you buy into, or, the people you might trust that, with a little bit of wisdom you get later in life after being on the planet for a little while, it's like, gosh, I just didn't know, and they don't. So oftentimes the sources of information that, whether they're relying on it or they're just the default, is media and like how we're socialized, you know,
Right.
as a society. What you see on TV, what bad behavior is condoned, you know, lack of holding people accountable for perpetuating more and more of the same cycle, it waters it down. And then it's just what's normal.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the misconception too of, well, everybody fights, you know, there's no such thing as a perfect relationship. So we get good at kind of excusing the little things here and there, right? Or dismissing what might be the warning signs or the red flags. And if that's hard for adults, like, we can't expect these teenagers
Yeah.
who have limited experience, they're just starting to enter not quite adulthood, but kind of like adulthood, right? Like a 16-year-old kid is in the dating world, and they're not an adult yet, but they're practicing adult relationships. And
Yeah.
so how are they learning what's healthy if there isn't a source of credible information provided to them? And that's another challenge we have in our programs is how do we get this information to these kids? How do we make this accessible, whether it's an app or social media? We have what is it called? This is showing you my age, not Twitter, the video one where you watch the videos.
TikTok.
TikTok.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, see, like, we got to be where they're at in order to get them the information we know they need.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really big piece, and I'm glad you're asking about it, because that's really a prime opportunity to shift the course. And, you know, it's tougher to do later in life, and if we have the opportunity when they're just getting started to understand what to look for, to understand what a healthy relationship even is, they can start looking for it. They can start practicing. They can start kind of examining, like, gosh, you know, maybe that isn't cool that I'm getting, you know, 25 texts before 9 a.m. Like, you know what I mean? Like, these are the things that become normalized that's excessive, but in order to start to challenge that perspective, they've got to have a sounding board. And each other, their peers, aren't always educated or savvy with these things. In fact, rarely, I would say. So yeah,
Yep.
that's a big piece, and it's a very vulnerable age category.
We have, and not just in Utah, but in a lot of places, you know, we're hesitant to teach controversial topics or what some consider to be controversial topics. Yeah, we won't teach sex ed, right? You know, try to get, you know, political discourse out of the classroom. This topic feels like it would run into a number of those same barriers. So, you know, what do we say to school administrators and what do we say to parents to kind of make this okay or make this an acceptable topic to discuss?
I do think it's okay to have this conversation without having to talk about sex, because we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about you know, non-romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Like, is it okay that your best friend is you know, using power and control dynamics to get their way all the time, right? Like, you see that dynamic exists, and it's not a romantic relationship.
Yeah.
And so just having an understanding of what's healthy, you know, are we, is there this like mutual respect, you know, are there exploitation dynamics that young adults could be experiencing with a new employer or a new roommate, or, I mean, these dynamics exist in all kinds of different relationships. So if we can start there, there's a better chance of applying that. But we've got to be able to say, and this also exists in romantic relationships.
Right.
And there are dangers that come along with private relationships that are really happening behind closed doors a lot of the time. And so to expose the silence around that is part of it. But we don't have to talk about safe sex to do it.
Yeah.
We
yeah.
can talk about this in so many other ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to, you know, kind of Lindsay's point, the material that we use is so relatable to all relationships. And we kind of, when we're going into classes or going into schools, we kind of use that same pitch of like, well, we can make this about friendships. We don't have to make it about romantic relationships.
Yeah.
That's typically the question we get from the school administrator of like,
Sure.
well, we don't want this to be about romantic relationships. We're like, That's okay. We'll talk about friendship. However, it is important to note that when the teenagers are asking the questions of our prevention educators, they're asking about romantic relationships generally. All the questions that we get in the class are about romantic relationships.
Yeah.
But that is the way in, so we'll take it to make it about friendship.
I appreciate you bringing that up because that's an important piece. If we're learning through these presentations and spending time with these youth, that they have all these questions, that signals that they aren't getting the information.
Yeah.
Or they're not sure if they have the right information.
Yeah.
They want to know. They're asking. They ask such good questions. And if we just listen to what these youth are asking, that might help parents and administrators
Yeah.
start to get curious about, gosh, you know what? What do they need? And how can we get behind that in a way that still, fits within those parameters of still giving parents the right to teach their youth about these topics, but to do this in a way that still empowers these youth to get a step ahead of things,
Yeah.
Before they're off and on their own, because the world it's a big place.
Yeah.
And if we've got them every day, Monday through Friday, all through high school, is there a way that we can capitalize on that opportunity
Yeah. Yeah.
to have influence?
Yeah. So Carol, you shared with me you've got kids.
Sure.
What would you want to see the schools do? Or what do you think the role of the school is?
I think teaching different behavior patterns. I think teaching kids to be assertive and what that means, and to speak the truth, and to have a safe place to do that. I think that's the number one thing that I've learned and developed with all my children, is we're really open. I felt like years before I was really hush, and just we talk about everything, and not just talk about it, but give them the 1, 2, 3, this is what you do, right? But keeping that open communication between children and parent is like the number one thing. And even if the relationship isn't ideal, right? But still making that, parents, we need to make it a safe place for our kids. Because it's happening.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We all know, like, more is happening than we realize. And if they even slightly bring it up, they've probably already done it.
Yeah.
Thinking about even the tiniest survivors that we have in our programs, teaching them, oftentimes we see anger from them and the experiences that they have witnessed. And we have programs that teach them. We use terms like lizard brain and wizard brain, and how do you switch from lizard brain to wizard brain, and just teaching them those skill sets so that they don't potentially become offenders themselves is really important. That education from the tiniest of survivors. You asked about the spectrum from those tiniest little people that are in our programs all the way to the 90-year-old man that was in our shelter. That it's a wide, vast spectrum, and we need to do education and support all across that.
And child sexual abuse, is another piece of what crosses into our worlds of, what we're responding to and helping families with. And when you think about, sexual abuse of children does get people's attention, parents, administrators, people perk up because that's scary as a parent. And, honestly, the best way, even though we can't always control every factor because we can't control perpetrators, but if we teach our children at a very young age, as soon as they're verbal, teach them about their body, about body safety, teach them about, get talking and, normalize the conversation. And that will encourage them to know it's okay to talk about it, and they're less susceptible because perpetrators will prey on children that aren't talking, that don't know these terms, that don't. So talking really is a big, I guess, tool to combat these issues, and I guess that would be what I would want to communicate to parents, administrators, and anybody that has an influence is actually exposing this, the silence around this, and early education from a really, really young age is statistically effective. If we just look at the research, it will tell us. That, I think, is a really important piece, is how can we get ahead of this from a really early stage
Yeah.
in the game of
Yeah.
life.
You know, Jill, you just mentioned you had a 90-year-old man who was in the shelter at one point. You know, elderly abuse is definitely an issue.
Yeah,
Everywhere.
it really, you could look at the mirror, take a mirror to our community, and
Yeah.
that's who we serve.
Yeah.
People with disabilities, different cultures, backgrounds, people who've only known poverty in their life, all the way to wealthy. It reaches everyone.
Yeah.
It's no respecter of persons. Like every socioeconomic class, every neighborhood.
What haven't we covered that we think we really want to be sure to get out there
I
today?
love to talk about the courage and the resilience of
Great.
survivors.
Let's do it.
And
let's do it.
I would love to turn it over to you, Carol. What have you learned about yourself in your recovery experience and the strength and your resilience and
I think
courage?
first and foremost, and it will be a long process, but trusting myself and believing myself and being able to trust my body signals. I know that seems so simple, but when I started out, I didn't know where I felt stress, or you know what I mean? I was so disassociated from my body. And so just kind of taking ownership of who I am and who I can be and who I always was, right? And I remember one time my mom told me, she goes, Carol, you've always been strong, because I think many survivors, they have so much shame. Why didn't I know? Why didn't I do this? How did I let this happen? And we can't go back in time. We can't change anything. The only thing we can do is go forward. So I would say my real growth has taken place. I actually worked with SVS first as a supporter and fundraising, but then I actually had an incident where I actually asked them for help and did some trauma therapy with them, because like you said, it's an ongoing process. And just finally getting to the root of some of the reasons why I do the things I do, and really seeing myself and seeing who I really am, has made all the difference. And so these organizations are there to empower men, women, children, whoever is affected or is a client. I've been able to accomplish some incredible things, not on my own, but because I've asked for help. I've sought mentorship and different therapies and resources. I know it's up to me, that I'm in charge of my own healing, that it's no one else's responsibility, and that I can't, I'm gonna have highs and lows, but I can't give up on myself, because I see this, I don't feel like it's just me I'm working for or fighting for. I have so many friends, family, community members, neighbors. It's such a common issue, and so the more you shed that shame, and you're just like, this is what it is. These things happened. They didn't happen to me, they happened. And change your story. And the future, I remember a friend just saying, you can do anything. And I never felt like that, and that's part of the reason why I went with this permission granted, because I felt like I had to have permission for everything, and I was just I felt like I was in this box and had such tight parameters around me. And so you have permission. I feel like I have permission to completely take control of my life and my future and with my children, and to really be a voice for all survivors.
This is one of my favorite parts of doing this work. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of people who are survivors, and they've gotten through the hard part and want to give back, whether it's serving on a board, donor, volunteer, whatever the case may be. And to see, we talk about the prevalence and the number of our family, friends, and neighbors that are experiencing this. But don't forget to look at the number of survivors that have prevailed and that are on the other side. And that, I think, instills hope for the survivor that's just starting to hear the strength and the resilience and the courage and the confidence from someone who's made it through to keep going. And that's one of the things I love about support group is the sharing, the shared, yes, the shared suffering, but the shared courage and strengthening that is so powerful when you get into a room with people who understand, and to be able to hear, Carol just sharing, like, that is powerful. That is so powerful. And that, I think, is what combats the difficulty in this conversation. This is hard stuff.
Yeah.
And also, there's this beautiful, bright, sunny day on the other side of the rainstorm.
We've talked a little bit about how silence really hides violence, right? And that communication and talking that can really expose that. But hearing your inspiring words, that can often help inspire someone else or notice something, right, that they may be going through, and then be inspired by your situation where you are to be able to take those first steps and move on. So it's just incredible to hear and hear where you are and the confidence that you have now. It's amazing.
It's easier to talk about the problem. It's easier to talk about what's wrong, and there may likely be a perception that, once somebody's come out on the other side of it, they're fine, right? But it is important, I agree, and I'm glad, Lindsay, that you asked that question, because I think it is important that we highlight success, right, and that we highlight progress. So thank you again and for sharing that with us. Anything else that we might have forgotten that we want to be sure that people know about?
What about the advocates? When someone calls in for the first time, what happens?
Our 24-hour helplines are the gateway to either scheduling an appointment with an advocate. Sometimes it's just asking questions. Sometimes it's to that desperate place of, I need somewhere to go. I'm literally on the street. And the 24-hour helpline is the gateway to, taking another step further and another step further. And just because someone calls that number does not mean that they're locked into a decision. They're not. It's not like, okay, well, now I'm too far in, there's no going back, and I'm not prepared for that. Like, it's just a phone call. It's just an opportunity to ask questions, find out more, and then you can always call back again. Or you can go ahead and schedule that appointment, or whatever, you're ready for. And that's one thing that I think is probably a little bit scary, is that perception that once I pick up the phone, cat's out of the bag, and it's all out there, and who knows what's going to spiral from there. And it's confidential for a reason, because people wouldn't call if they didn't know it was a confidential source of support that is not going to tell you what to do. It's really designed to respond to what your needs are. Like, we don't go on rescue missions. We don't go out and try to find all the people that are at risk and that are being harmed. We are there for when they are ready to come to us, because it's on their terms, and we want it to be on their terms and stay on their terms. I don't know if that's what you were.
Yeah, no, I just think the more accessible people have to, like, that first responder, the advocate, I just think that between all the different religious organizations, all the different, workplace, that if we're all working together, that that they're directed to at least have that conversation. Because I know for me and many people that I've spoke to, they didn't even know they were in an abusive relationship. They just had this dynamic, but they didn't have the words and the vocabulary to identify it, let alone if they haven't talked about it with anybody. So that's, the advocate can kind of say, hey, this isn't normal. This isn't okay.
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes you just need someone to say that to you, because this is your normal. So I just think the power of that first phone call or talking to an advocate is really important.
As like a friend, family member, community member, I think kind of some of the things we've highlighted as well is, being that place that can create safety, believing their story, but then knowing that there are advocates that can help. And so I think having that, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as that friend is say, let's call this helpline together. Not just giving them the paper, but saying, do you want me to call you with you? Do you want me to sit here while you call? And so knowing that you don't have to have all the answers as the person who thinks that you might know that something's going on. They're like Jill's mentioned, there's experts and there's advocates that are waiting on that other line. And their job as an advocate is to, listen, hear them, and then offer resources. But it's really up to that survivor to, make their choices.
Yeah.
And they will meet you where you are.
Yeah.
It brings me back to that great permission granted. that we grant you permission to drive this the direction that you want to go. We will share all the resources and options that are available to you, but you have permission to take this, and we will walk as slow or as fast in whatever direction you want to go. But this is you,
Yeah.
and we're here to support you.
Yeah, those advocates are there and ready also to help with safety planning, right? Whether that is making a plan to physically leave or just making a plan to make sure you and your children are safe if you are in a situation that may become violent. So that's a key piece too, I think, that, like you said, you're not locked into making any sort of decision, but they can talk you through planning to make sure that you can stay safe no matter what you choose to do.
Before we break, I want to ask each of you to, again, give the name of your organization and your internet URL.
I'm on Instagram, and it's Carol K. Permission Granted.
Right. Ashley?
Yeah, The Refuge Utah, and our website is therefugeutah.org.
Okay, cool.
CAPSA, and our website is capsa.org.
Dove Center, which is dovecenter.org. And you can also find Dove Center on Instagram and Facebook as well. And if that's something that you feel comfortable messaging through, then you can message our advocates there.
Right.
And South Valley Services is svsutah.org. And we also are over services provided in Tooele County, as well as the kind of the western southern portion of Salt Lake County, but we serve Salt Lake County and Tooele counties.
One more URL for folks. The Utah Domestic Violence Coalition is udvc.org. And again, I just want to remind folks that if you or a family member, friend, employee, if you are in need of assistance, you can, of course, reach out to any of the organizations that we just spoke with, or you can call the Domestic Violence Coalition hotline at 1-800-897-LINK. That's 1-800-897-5465. So in closing, I want to thank you all again. It means a lot that you took the time to come and speak with us today. And, you know, the information is fantastic, and I'm looking forward to more conversations, looking forward to everything we're going to do together in October. Yeah, I think it's going to be really great to continue to create awareness and support for the organizations and for the folks of Utah. And for everybody else out there, I want to thank you very much for listening and watching. Remember that you can subscribe to Altabanking wherever you subscribe to your podcasts, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.